Okay, today we're going to learn Eruvin Daf Samach Vav. Today's daf is dedicated in memory of Avram Nachum ben Yitzchak Raphael on his yurtzeit. His dedication to Daf Yomi is an inspiration to his family who continue in his footsteps. And by Debbie and Michael Schreiber, in honor of their first grandchild, Naomi Frumit, to our children, Yardain and Adam Schreiber of Jerusalem. May she flourish and grow. May our parents raise her to Torah, Chuppah, and Masim Tovim in a home that I know will be filled with love and simcha and Torah learning. Mazal tov. Okay, there's a sheet today. It'll definitely help you and organize what we're going to do. So we ended yesterday with a story. The story was that a bunch of rabbis came to a certain inn, a pundak, and the non-Jewish owner wasn't there. They made an eruv before Shabbat. All was good. Shows up the non-Jewish owner on Shabbat, and all of a sudden they're in a problem because what happens? He shows up. Basically, it cancels their eruv, so they're stuck. What do? They say, can we rent space from him on Shabbat, right? Remember, we said there's two ways of viewing this. Rental, is it a real serious rental or is it something weak? You'd have to say, if you could do it on Shabbat, it must be something weaker, not really like a serious rental, because obviously otherwise you couldn't do it on Shabbat. So there was a debate between Rabbi Chanina bar Yosef, Rabbi Asi, and they decided, based on Rabbi Chia bar Abba said, let's rely on the opinion that says it's okay. And then they asked Rabbi Yochanan after the fact, like the other story we saw yesterday, and he said, and that's the beginning of today's daf, Yafeh asitem shesachartem. Good job that you did that. That was a good solution. So there's two issues, and this is very important to understand today's daf. There's two issues with what he said to them. Number one, you have the issue that he said, you can rent on Shabbat, number one, from a non-Jew. This space, again, it doesn't mean you can rent in general. It means for the purposes of Eruv, one can do this. The second issue, okay, maybe actually we'll start with the first issue. We'll see the question, and then I'll move on to the second issue so that you remember it when we get there. So the Gemara starts off, first line here, Ta'u ba Nehardea. The people of Nehardea questioned, or the rabbis of Nehardea questioned, didn't understand. Umiyamar Rabbi Yochanan Hachi, did Rabbi Yochanan really say that one can rent from a non-Jew on Shabbat? If you rent, you're like someone who does an eruv, okay? Meaning, schirut is like making an eruv. Now, what would you think that means, if not our issue? Just like you need to have your eruv all set before Shabbat, you can't put together an eruv on Shabbat. Likewise, you can't rent on Shabbat. But they come and they say no. In order to resolve this contradiction of Rabbi Yochanan from the fact that he said it's okay that you do it on Shabbat, and from the fact that he said in another place, Eruv is, schirut is like Eruv, so he must have meant something else. And we're now going to see three similarities between schirut and Orev, making an Eruv, Ma'arev, that Rabbi Yochanan must have meant, and not our issue about Shabbat. So here come the three. Look, number one, Ma ma'arev afilu b'pachot mishaveh pruta. If you want to be part of the Eruv, you can put in a value of food that's even less than a pruta. Then write a simple coin. You can even write, pruta is always the amount, the minimum value of something that's needed. In Eruv, you don't need that. Likewise, in schirut, you don't need that. You could rent a portion of the non-Jews' property that's worth even less than a pruta, which we saw before, that anything involving non-Jews, right, there's no minimum requisite amount. That's number one. Number two, Mama arev, afilu schiro ulekito. Remember, we learned that if there's a non-Jew living there and he won't rent you the space, what can we say? Well, if there's a Jew who's a hired laborer there or works collecting the fruits or vegetables in his house, in his property, then he can basically join the Eruv. There's no schirut in that case. He just joins our Eruv, and he's a representative of the non-Jew, or really he's representing himself. He has rights to the non-Jew's property. He can join the Eruv. So just like that can be done by schiro and lekito, af socher afilu schiro ulekito. Likewise, someone who, if you want to rent from the non-Jew, and let's say the non-Jew doesn't allow you, and let's say he doesn't have a Jewish laborer that we can rent from, that we can have join the Eruv, but he has non-Jewish workers who are schiros or lekitos, and they, if they say, oh yeah, I'll rent you my share of his house or part of my share of his house, they can do that also. So you can have a schiro and lekito rent you the space. Not only a schiro lekito Jew living in a non-Jew's house can join the Eruv on his behalf or on behalf of his house. You could have a non-Jewish schiro and lekito do the schirut, he can rent you a little part of it for, right? And then basically you won't need an Eruv. Or in other words, your Eruv will work even though there's a non-Jew there. ומה מערב 5 ששרויים בחצר אחת, אחד מערב על ידי כולם, סוחר נמי 5 ששרויים בחצר אחת, אחד סוחר על ידי כולם. Just like if you have 5 people in a chatzer, one can be the representative of all of them. Like if they go to a nearby chatzer and they want to do an eruv with them, one can go as a representative of all of them. Likewise, if you have, one can rent on behalf of all the others. You don't need to make a rental contract with each individual Jew. These, by the way, these 2 last things are what we do in Eruv generally. When you live in a city where there's a lot of non-Jews, right? You're outside of Israel. So what do you do about, or even in Israel, there's non-Jewish property. So what do? You basically have you have a representative of the community that basically rents. So there's the one out of all the people in the courtyard that basically does a rental agreement, not with all the non-Jews, right? He does the rental agreement. It's almost like schiro and lakito. Right? He does it usually with the municipality. Now, the municipality, there's actually a debate about what rights does the municipality have to our houses, right? And there's let's say, you could say maybe, well, the police can go search your houses if they want, or there's certain criteria that make it that they are represented. They're almost like a sechiro and lakito, and they allow, right? It allows them to be a representative of everybody else. Okay, so therefore, you could say property tax maybe. Right? There's a debate about what exactly allows us to do this, but basically everyone agrees that it's allowed, that they can be representative of everybody else. Okay, so that was an aside because we were just trying to figure out what did Rabbi Yochanan mean when he said socher k'ma'arev dami. We said it must be in these 3 ways. It's like Eruv, like someone who's making an Eruv, but not for the fact that you can't do it on Shabbat. No, Rabbi Yochanan thinks you can do it on Shabbat. Now comes the second question. Now, the second question is based on a certain premise that came out of Divrei Rabbi Yochanan, which we didn't actually discuss. But what happens here when Rabbi Yochanan says this works, what happens? If you remember, what I said in the beginning was that when the non-Jew shows up on the scene, it cancels their Eruv. Well, if it cancels their Eruv and you can't do a new Eruv on Shabbat, how's this going to work? Basically, what happens, the non-Jew comes, he cancels out the Eruv because the Eruv is now no longer valid because there's a non-Jew who's not, right, who obviously can't be part of the Eruv, but he hasn't rented you the space. Now on Shabbat, he rents you the space. But at this point, you can't make a new Eruv because it's Shabbat. So what must Rabbi Yochanan think you have to do? One of the people living in that, or whoever's, all the people living in that inn for Shabbat, that hotel they were in, they all have to cancel their reshut to, it's what we call bitul reshut. They say, listen, they say to one of the people there, you have rights to come into our rooms. You can do whatever you want in them. We're canceling our reshut to you. And that you can do on Shabbat. We've learned already you could do that on Shabbat. The big debate is going to be, and Rabbi Yochanan thinks no problem to do this on Shabbat. But we're going to see that Shmuel says you can't do bitul reshut if you can't do Eruv. And in this case, you can't make an Eruv, so then you can't do bitul reshut. And for that, we're going to start with Shmuel, and Shmuel's going to basically take us for the rest of the daf. Okay, to get to Shmuel, we're going to start with Rabbi Elazar. It's a little bit of an intro to this whole thing, which is, it now says, just like Tauba Nahardea didn't understand what Rabbi Yochanan did based on what Rabbi Yochanan said elsewhere. Now we're going to say, Taiba Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar didn't understand what Rabbi Yochanan was doing here, paskening this way. Now, it doesn't tell you what he was confused by, but he was confused by Rabbi Yochanan's psak. So Amar Rabbi Zera, my tiyad Rabbi Elazar. I don't understand what was difficult for Rabbi Elazar. That's what Rabbi Zera says. So Amar Rav Sheshet. Here Rav Sheshet responds to Rabbi Zera. Gavar Rabbak Rabbi Zera lo yada maiti yada Rabbi Elazar. How could he not understand what was difficult to Rabbi Elazar? It's obvious what was difficult to Rabbi Elazar. And here goes. Kakashele de Shmuel Rabbi. He had difficulty because of Shmuel, his rabbi. He looked at what Shmuel said, and he said, based on what Shmuel says, Rabbi Yochanan's psak makes no sense. And we're basically going to see that Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan disagree about this issue. Why? Damar Shmuel, and we won't really understand this right away. We're then going to explain what this means. And there's a chart on the page explaining this. Kol makom she'osrin u'ma'arvin. He's basically going to give 3 situations of different permutations of oslim and ma'arvin. Oslim means people in one area forbid the other from carrying. Ma'arvin means they can make an eruv. So if they forbid each other from carrying from one to the other, and they can make an eruv between them if they wanted, then mivatlim. In other words, this is what we said. If there's potential to make an eruv, then one of them can be mivatel reshut to the other. Ma'arvin ve'ein osrin. What right? Ma'arvin ve'ein osrin. Osrin. Sorry, I didn't read it right. Marvin ve'ein osrin. Osrin ve'ein marvin. Okay, these are two different cases. Either they can make an eruv, but they're not forbidden one to the other. Again, we're going to see in a minute what all these cases are. It's very up in the air right now, so don't worry that you don't understand. Or osrin ve'ein marvin, or they forbid each other and they can't make an eruv. Ein mevatlin. In this case, both these cases, you cannot do bitul reshut. Now, one of them is going to be our situation because it's going to be a case where they're osrim zalzeh and ein ma'arvin. They can't make an eruv because it's Shabbat. Okay, so let's see. Kol makom she'osrin u'ma'arvim mevatlin. So, what would be a case where osrin u'ma'arvim, and yet we're going to and therefore we're going to allow you levatlin. Okay, so let's look at the pictures. 1 second, I have to pull it up. It's not open. 1 minute. Here it goes. Okay, go back to my Zoom. Okay. Our first picture is picture number 233. Okay, so you have a case where Kigon shte chatzerot, zo lifnim mizo. We're very familiar with this. Remember, we've talked about it a few times. There's an inner courtyard and an outer courtyard, and only from the outer courtyard can you get into the public thoroughfare, into Reshut HaRabim. So in this case, what's the situation? This is a case of osrin u'ma'arvin. The inner forbids the outer, right? Because the inner can go into the outer, and the outer can go into the inner because there's a petach beinehem. They both exit from the same place. So they're forbidden one to the other. If they're forbidden one to the other, and yet, if they want, they can make an eruv altogether. So that's a case of osrin u'ma'arvin. Let's say they did an eruv, but one of the houses, doesn't matter which one, didn't join the eruv. According to this, on Shabbat, they could say, I'm mevatel my reshut to the rest of you, and that would work because it's a case of osrin u'ma'arvin. What's the next case? Marvin ve'ein osrin. In this case, we're going to say ein mevatlin. In this case, they can't do bitul reshut. Why? First, let's explain what it is, and then we'll explain why. Kigon, so picture 234. Shte chatzerot u'petach hacha benehen. If you have two courtyards with an entrance way in between each one, in other words, there's a way, if there was just a brick wall and it was solid, they couldn't make an eruv. This is a case where if they want, they can make an eruv, okay? If courtyard A wants to make an eruv with courtyard B, they can. However, since each of them open up to the public domain on their own, they each have their own exit to the Reshut HaRabim, therefore, they're osrim, so they forbid, they're ma'arvin ve'ein osrin. This is a case of they can make an eruv if they want, but let's say courtyard A didn't make an eruv with courtyard B. What would happen? Courtyard A had their own eruv, courtyard B had their own eruv. That would work perfectly fine. Because each one has its own exit. So basically, courtyard A could carry within their courtyard, no problem. And courtyard B could carry within their courtyard, no problem. That's different from the previous case. In the previous case, if inner courtyard made an eruv and outer courtyard made an eruv separately, not together, each one, their eruv won't help them because each one can go into the other space and it's going to create a problem. We'll see later that maybe there's some situation that could work. But right now, we're going to assume it can't work at all. But in the second case, and I'm sorry, right, they would basically forbid each other. That's osrin. Since they forbid each other, this is the way it works. In the inner and outer, since they forbid each other, we're going to allow bitul reshut, because if we don't allow bitul reshut on Shabbat, what's going to happen? Basically, no one can carry anywhere. So that's the whole heter of bitul reshut. It's to make everybody's lives easier. But if you have these two courtyards that each can carry within their own courtyard and they don't forbid each other and they each have their own exit to the Reshut HaRabim, we're not going to allow bitul reshut because they're each their own space. So bitul reshut doesn't work. Okay, those don't yet have anything to do with Rabbi Yochanan. But this last case is going to have to do with the case of Rabbi Yochanan. The third case is osrin ve'ein ma'arvin, ein mevatlin. Now, what could possibly be a case where you're forbidden to each other, right? Like the two chatzerot, one in out, one out, inner outer, they forbid each other, or some situation where people can't carry. But ein ma'arvin. Now in the inner and outer, of course they can make an eruv if they wanted to. But here, what could this be? La'atuye mai, lav la'atuye nochri. It must be a case where there's a nochri. And that's why they're oslin ve'ein ma'arvin, right? And now, what would be the case of a nochri where you wouldn't be allowed to make an eruv? Well, ida ata me'etmo, if the nochri showed up, the Gentiles showed up before Shabbat, you could potentially make an eruv. That was what, right? What would you do? Lo gar me'etmo. You make a rental agreement with a non-Jew. Then it would be a case where oslin, but ma'arvin. There's a solution. You can make an eruv. But we're trying to find oslin ve'ein ma'arvin. And then, again, what did Shmuel say? If oslin ein ma'arvin, what's the law? Ein mevatlin. So now, what must be the case? It must be a nochri, a Gentile, and it must be exactly our case. Elalav da'ata b'shabta. It must be they're oslin because there's a non-Jew there. He shows up on Shabbat. And why ein ma'arvin? Because it's Shabbat, and you now can't make an eruv because it's Shabbat. You're not allowed to make an eruv on Shabbat. In this case, since when you became forbidden, there was no opportunity to make an eruv because it all happened on Shabbat. What do we say? Katane oslin ve'ein ma'arvin ein mevatlin. It says if this is the situation, then one cannot relinquish one's rights, which means, Shema Mina, what can we infer from here that what Rabbi Yochanan said is wrong? Again, according to Shmuel. Okay, we're going to basically say that Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan have different opinions about this. Rabbi Yochanan thinks there's no problem for everyone else to relinquish their rights. Again, this didn't say explicitly in the story, but it was implicit because there's no other way it would have worked if they didn't relinquish their rights. So therefore, Shmuel seems to say this third case of Shmuel must be exactly this case. And he says bitul reshut would not work. Relinquishing your rights doesn't work. And there we see that's why Rabbi Elazar was struggling with what Rabbi Yochanan did, because he said that seems to go against Shmuel. Okay. Now we're going to continue along in Shmuel from a bit of a different perspective. Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says, Lo shmiya li hashmata. I never heard this law of Shmuel. I don't know what you're talking about. Amar le Abaye. Remember, Rav Yosef forgets his Torah a lot, and Abaye reminds him. So Abaye comes and says, what are you talking about? Atamar nialan. You told us this. And where did you tell us this? And now he's trying to refresh his memory. He says, Aha Amar nialan. You said it to us about the following statement. You said, Da Amar Shmuel, the Shmuel said, Ein bitul reshut mechatzer lechatzer. One can't relinquish. Okay, let's go backwards about relinquishing rights. The case we talked about relinquishing rights was when you have, the case was 5 people living in a courtyard. It doesn't have to be 5. It could be any amount of people, more than 2. They do an eruv together, but one forgets to join the eruv. And now it's Shabbat, and we're stuck because if one doesn't join the eruv, remember, he's osel. That's what we keep talking about, oslim. He forbids everyone else from carrying because he didn't join the eruv. So now he can do bitul reshut. He can say, I relinquish my rights to everybody in the courtyard. But what does it say here? Shmuel says, Ein bitul reshut mechatzer lechatzer. You can't do it from courtyard to courtyard. You can only do it like the case that we talked about, where there's one courtyard and one of the members didn't join. And that's because we want to make people's lives easier in a courtyard. But when it's from courtyard to courtyard, we don't allow that. And now we're going to have a whole discussion about this statement that he says, Ein bitul reshut mechatzer lechatzer. Is it every case? Some cases we're going to see. So basically, if you say Ein bitul reshut mechatzer lechatzer, that's basically going to teach you. So we'll see. We'll see how he gets to it from there. And the second thing he said was Ein bitul reshut bechorva. And also, the way Rashi explains it is, if there's a desolate space in between 2 houses in the courtyard, you also can't do bitul reshut from that space to the other people, because it's not a space. And the whole logic of all of this is that if it's not a space that's commonly used, or there's not a big need for this leniency, then we're not going to use this leniency. So in the chorva, it's not a case that's commonly used. In a chatzer, everybody's got their own courtyard, so they don't need it as much, right? We only allow it if you can't actually carry in your own courtyard. So now we're going to say like this. So now Abai continues, Va'amart lan ala, and you said to us about this, and now we're going to get into the details of the cases we saw before. when you taught us that Shmuel said, Ein bitul reshut mechatzer lechatzer, one can't relinquish rights from one courtyard to another, you explained to us that Ki Amar Shmuel Ein bitul reshut mechatzer lechatzer, lo amaran ela shtei chatzerot upetach ha benehem. Now, what he's going to be referring to here, and this is why it's important to understand, we're shifting a little from our topic because Shmuel said 3 cases. If you remember, and you can go back to your chart, right? Kol makom she'oslin u'ma'arvim mivatlin, ma'arvim ve'ein oslin ein mivatlin. The 3rd case was the one that interested us, which is oslin ve'ein ma'arvim ein mivatlin. That was the one that he disagreed with Rabbi Yochanan about. We're now going to talk about the first 2, okay? Because basically Rabbi Yosef says, I never heard Shmuel say these 3 things. And Abai is going to say, you taught us the first 2 100%, okay? So that's what he's going to show. So again, it's a little off our topic because our topic was the Gentile. We're not talking about the Gentile case. We're going to talk about now the 2 cases that we saw the pictures of, okay? Let's go back to the pictures. The Chatzir Zo Lifnim Mizo and the Shtei Chatzerot Ze Liad Ze, right, where each one opens up to Reshut Rabim on their own. So now he's going to say like this. Rabbi Yosef, you told us, Ki Amar Shmuel Ein bitul reshut mechashut lechatzer lechatzer. It was only in one of these cases. One of these cases you can't do it, the other one you can. And this is exactly what the first 2 statements of Shmuel were. Ela, shtei chatzerot, right? Lo amaran ela. The only case you said where you can't do bitul reshut is shtei chatzerot upetach ha benehem, where you have 2 courtyards, both at exit to the public domain, and there's a little entranceway between them. Then in that case, mitoch she'osrin ze al ze mivatlin, right? Since they forbid each other, sorry, I just read that wrong. I skipped a line. Upetach ha benehem, period. Okay, that was the case where you said, since each one can basically make their own Eruv and they don't forbid each other, that's why we don't allow bitul reshut. We don't allow you to relinquish your rights to the other. But, and that's when Shmuel, again, remember, what did Shmuel say according to Rav Yosef? You can't do bitul reshut from one courtyard to another. That's in this case. But if you go back to the previous picture, 233, if one is an inner courtyard and one is an outer courtyard, since they forbid each other, therefore one can relinquish rights. Because if we don't allow relinquishing of rights, remember the whole logic is we need to allow relinquishing of rights if people have no other way to carry. These people have no way to carry because they forbid each other, because each one can walk into the other and they only have one exit, one shared exit. So since they're osrim al zeh mivatlin. So basically he says to Rav Yosef, this is what you told us. I don't know what you're talking about that you don't know. I'm trying to refresh your memory. You actually told us what Shmuel said. So Amar Le comes Rav Yosef and he says, okay, you've refreshed my memory somewhat. He says, Ana amina mishmei de Shmuel hachi. Oh, sorry, my mistake. Let me go back to that line. He questions and he says, he doesn't remember yet. Okay, sorry, he doesn't remember at all. He says, Ana amina mishmei de Shmuel hachi. I said that in the name of Shmuel. Didn't Shmuel say, Ha'amar Shmuel, ein lanu be'eruvin ela kilashon mishnatenu. We only have by Eruvin the way our Mishnah says. Now, what Mishnah is he talking about? He's talking about the Mishnah on Samach Tet Amud Bet, which we haven't seen yet inside, and we actually quoted part of it. But the Mishnah on Samach Tet Amud Bet says, Anshe Chatzer sheshachach echad mehem velo erev beito. Right? That's if one person forgets, and then later, right, it says he's a soul, he can't, and then there's a debate. Remember, we saw can they, can he, all different options. But that's where they talk in that Mishnah about bitul reshut. And what does it say? It says in the Mishnah, Anshe Chatzer velo Anshe Chatzerot. Basically, it says like this. How could I have said that? I remember something else that Shmuel said. Shmuel said, when it comes to Eruvin, we follow the Mishnah exactly, the way the Mishnah says it. Now, what could he be referring to? If not, this case of bitul reshut. By bitul reshut, it says in the Mishnah, people of one courtyard, meaning one person to other people within the same courtyard, but not from courtyard to courtyard. So how could you possibly say, it says, Anshe Chatzer velo Anshe Chatzerot. Shmuel could not possibly have thought that there is a situation where one courtyard could cancel relinquish their rights to the other, because of what Shmuel said here. So Abai has an answer for him. Amar le, ki amar lan, ein lanu be'eruvin ela kilashon mishnatenu. Aha, Martlan. He wasn't saying it about that line, about the Chatzer. He was saying it about a different line. What line? Shamavoy lachatzerot kechatzer labatim. When it comes to Chatzer Lebatim, in order to do Eruv Chatzerot, remember we learned there's Eruv Chatzerot and there's Shituf Mavo'ot. This is a good time to review. Eruv Chatzerot means people of one courtyard want to carry within the courtyard. They do what we call Eruv Chatzerot. They put food, everybody puts some food together, and that allows them to carry within the courtyard. Shituf Mavo'ot is that people in different Chatzerot in the Mavoi join together. Now, what's the minimum you need for a Chatzer to do an Eruv? You need 2 houses. If you don't have 2 houses, right, there's no Eruv, it's 1 house. So because you need 2 houses for a Chatzer, they say you also need 2 courtyards for a Mavoi. It's like an analogy. Houses to Chatzer are like Chatzer to Mavoi. So you can't fix a Mavoi unless you have at least 2 Chatzerot open to the Mavoi. So that's when Shmuel said you can't veer from what the Mishnah says, not about relinquishing rights. Okay, so now I see Shoshana, you're asking a question. I think your question is going to be answered at the end of today's daf. And there's one other question, right? What does relinquishing rights exactly mean? So you asked Art. Relinquishing rights means it's not that I don't live in this courtyard. It really means that everyone else has rights to use my courtyard. You can come in, you can use it, you can have rights to my property. Okay, it's a certain amount of giving up rights, to giving up sole rights to your property by saying other people can come and use it. So now, basically, Abaye has proven to Rav Yosef that it's possible that Rav Yosef says this. Rav Yosef still doesn't remember that he said it, but he basically says, what you claim that Shmuel says, we have to follow the Mishnah exactly, wasn't about the Chatzer, that it's only individual. Basically, again, what's he saying? There could be a situation where Anshe Chatzer can relinquish rights to a different Chatzer. Okay, and that's when there's an inner and an outer. Okay, so now, Gufa. We're going to go more in depth into the statement of Shmuel that Abaye quoted, Rav Yosef is quoting Shmuel about. So we've started with, remember, I just want to keep reminding you so you don't get lost. We started with Rabbi Yochanan in that story. We brought a question about one part of it. How could you do it on Shabbat? We answered that. Then we brought a question of Rabbi Elazar from Shmuel's statement and said, how could Rabbi Yochanan do it in light of what Shmuel said? And we basically say, Shmuel disagreed, right? In bringing that, we brought 3 statements of Shmuel, and we focused, the last one was focusing on was about the Gentile case. And that basically meant that according to Shmuel, there was no way they could relinquish their rights on Shabbat in a time when they couldn't possibly have made an Eruv after they rented the space from the non-Jew. So that's one aspect. But since he quoted Shmuel, and there were 2 other halachot Shmuel gave, which is he differentiated between inner outer courtyard and side-by-side courtyard, each with their own exits, about whether one could do bitul reshut or not in each of those cases. We're now dealing with that. So that Abaye told Rav Yosef said, I never heard that. Abaye says, yes, you did. You told it to us, etc. And in that, we quoted this line about ein bitul reshut mi chatzer lechatzer. So now we're going to go in depth and we're going to see that in fact Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Shmuel about that also. So we're off of our topic of Gentiles and Shabbat. We're moving into a different topic, which was when can one relinquish rights if there's 2 courtyards next to each other? Do we say across the board there's no relinquishing of rights from courtyard to courtyard? Do we say in some cases, or do we say you can entirely? Okay, so Shmuel said you can't relinquish rights from courtyard to courtyard. Abaye said that Rav Yosef had explained to us that it depends on the situation, okay? So it could possibly be done in certain circumstances. So now we have Gufa. So now we're going to go in depth into this thing. Amar Shmuel, ein bitul reshut b'chatzer lechatzer ve'ein bitul reshut b'churva. For Rabbi Yochanan Amar, yesh bitul reshut b'chatzer lechatzer ve'yesh bitul reshut b'churva. Rabbi Yochanan thinks one can relinquish rights from courtyard to courtyard. He disagrees with everything Shmuel said, basically. And there's bitul reshut also in a churva. So now they want to know, why did you need to mention, before we get more into this, why did you need to mention both cases? Wouldn't you be unable to learn one from the other? If you could do it in a chatzer to chatzer, you could do it in a chorva or the reverse, because they're both situations that aren't necessary. So they say, well, tzricha, you needed to teach both cases. Why? You could say, Bahaka Amar Shmuel. There, Shmuel didn't allow me chatzer lechatzer, but maybe would have allowed a chorva. Why? Mishum dahatashmish telechud, vahatashmish telechud. In the courtyard case where there's 2 chatzerot, each one has its own exit to the public domain, so they're each independent, and therefore they can't. But chorva, this chorva is in between 2 houses and can serve both of them. Maybe he would have allowed it. Maybe you would think they can relinquish rights. The chi'itmar baha, and if you had just the case of the chorva, you might have said, now it's the same logic, but focus on Rabbi Yochanan. You would say maybe in the chorva case, baha kama Rabbi Yochanan, because they share this space. Aval bahach, but in the chatzir case, maybe modile the shmuel, that they can't relinquish rights because they're two separate spaces, and each can make their own separate eruv, and each doesn't forbid the other. So tzricha, you needed both cases to learn that both of them forbid. Now, Amar Abaye. Now we're going to learn a machloket Abaye and Rava about Shmuel. Hada Amar Shmuel. Now this is exactly what we already learned. So this is just reviewing, because remember, Abaye was the one who reminded Rav Yosef of what he taught, and this is the way Abaye understands Shmuel. But Rav is going to understand Shmuel differently. So Hada Amar Shmuel, this is just review. Ein bitul reshut mechatzer lechatzer lo amaran ela. Right? It wasn't any situation. There are situations when one can do it. Remember, inner, outer, it can be done. So lo amaran, it was only said ela b'shtei chatzerot upetachacha benehem, two courtyards next to each other with an entrance between them, an opening between them, but each one has its own separate exit, and therefore there's no bitul reshut. Aval shtei chatzerot zo lifnei mizo she'osrin mivatlin. But if there's an inner and an outer, one forbids the other, and therefore they can, since they forbid each other, one can relinquish rights. That so far was review. But here comes Rav, and he has a different understanding. Hold off on trying to understand, because we're going to have a few sections here where first they're going to quote it, then they're going to say, what are each of these cases without really explaining. Then they're going to explain the logic behind each case. So only when we get to the logic part am I going to really start explaining, because before that, it doesn't really make much sense yet. Rava Amar, afilu shtei chatzerot zo lifnei mizo, pa'amim mevatlin, pa'amim ein mevatlin. He says, Abaye, it's not as simple as you said. The inner and the outer courtyard case, okay, let's pull it up on the picture so you see it in front of you. The inner and the outer courtyard, okay, right? The upper one is the inner, the bottom one is the outer. You said that they can always relinquish rights. I say that according to Shmuel, they can't always relinquish rights. It depends on the scenario. Ketzad, so now we want to know what's the scenario, okay? If you look at your sheet, I charted it out also to help you view it better. Natnu Eruvin b'chitzona, okay, there's going to be different options. There's going to be where the Eruv is physically sitting in the outer courtyard, or the Eruv is physically sitting in the inner courtyard. Okay, and it's going to make a difference, and we'll see why. And then it's going to be, we're going to have all different permutations. One is where's the Eruv, and the second is who's the one that forgot to relinquish? Where is there a person, one of them, and there's four houses in this picture. So two in the inner, two in the outer. One of the houses, they made an Eruv, but one of the houses forgot to be part of the Eruv. So which one is it, the inner or the outer? So we're going to have where's the Eruv sit and who's the person who forgot. So natnu Eruvin b'chitzona v'shachachecha b'min hapnimit b'min hachitzona. If the Eruv's in the outer courtyard, and it doesn't matter where the person is that forgot, v'lo irev, and they didn't join the Eruv, shtein asurot. Okay, everyone's forbidden. And then if they're all forbidden, then remember how it goes hand in hand. If no one can carry, then we're going to allow relinquishing of rights. If already someone can carry, we're not going to allow relinquishing of rights. Natnu Eruvin b'pnimit. Again, we don't understand why this is. We'll get to it soon. Natnu Eruvin b'pnimit. If the Eruv was in the inner courtyard, v'shachachacha min hapnimit, and one of the inner people forgot, v'lo irev, shtehan asurot, and one of the inner people didn't join the Eruv, they're all forbidden. Shachachacha min hachitzona v'lo irev, but if one of the outer people forgot, pnimi muteret v'chitzona asura. The pnimi people can carry. Shoshan, this goes back to your question you asked, and we'll get back to that. I'll explain soon. And the chitzona is forbidden. So let's go through the cases because we don't really understand why. Natnu Eruvin b'chitzona. So starting from the beginning, your Eruv was in the outer courtyard. V'shachach echad bein min hapnimi u'bein min hachitzona. Okay, it doesn't matter which one. V'lo irev shtehan asurot. Why? So now we're going to go into why, and we're going to go one by one. Hi bar pnimit. Let's say it was the pnimi guy who forgot. So the Eruv's in the chitzoni. He's in the inner courtyard. Liman libatel. Who's he going to relinquish his rights to? Libatel libnei pnimit. If he wants to relinquish his rights to the other person in his inner courtyard, leita le'eruvayu gabayu. You have to relinquish your rights to a place where the Eruv is. When you all live in one courtyard, it's very easy. The Eruv's in your courtyard. You could just relinquish your rights to the people in the courtyard. But here, you say, wait a minute, he can't, relinquishing his rights to the guy next door to him isn't going to help, because the guy next door to him isn't where the Eruv is. So that's not going to help him. Well, libate livnei chitzona, but what does Shmuel say? If he wants to relinquish his rights to the outer courtyard, Shmuel says you can't relinquish your rights to someone in a different courtyard. So therefore, okay, he's understanding a little differently than we did before. He's saying one can't relinquish rights to someone who's sitting in a different courtyard physically. So the inner guy for sure can't cancel his rights if the Eruv's in the outer courtyard, because it won't help to the inner person and it can't work to the outer person. Right, one is ineffective. He could do it. He could relinquish his rights to the inner guy, but it won't help him because the Eruv doesn't sit there. And he's not allowed to relinquish his rights to the outer courtyard. Hi, Bar Chitzona. What about the guy in the outer courtyard? Well, Lemani Batel. Who can he cancel his rights to? Well, Libata Lebnei Chitzona. What's the problem? If he relinquishes his rights to everybody in the outer courtyard, it's very nice for the outer courtyard, but what's still the problem? The people in the inner courtyard don't have access to his house. He's not part of the Eruv, and he didn't relinquish his rights to them. So they basically, the inner people, since they have what we call, again, drisat regel, they walk through this courtyard to get out. So basically, if let's say in this left-hand house, in the outer courtyard, he didn't join the Eruv, right? Let's call them houses A, B, C, and D. So C didn't join the Eruv. A, B, and D are together. C relinquishes his rights to D. Now, you might say because he relinquished his rights, maybe D represents, but they don't say that. They basically say if C relinquishes his rights to D, still he doesn't have any connection with A and B. So A and B basically forbid him from being allowed to carry here, which means that no one can carry. Libata libnei pnimit, right? So if he relinquishes to the outer, to C relinquishes to D, they're both in the outer courtyard, that won't help him from the inner people. Let's say he goes to relinquish his rights to the inner people. What's the problem? That's what Shmuel says. You can't relinquish your rights to someone in a different courtyard. So basically, that's never going to work. But Natsnu Eruvan b'pnimit. If their Eruv is in the pnimit, v'shachach echad min ha'pnimit v'lo irev, shtehan asura. So this also isn't going to work. If the Eruv is in the pnimit, and who forgot? One of the inner people. So now, theoretically, he could cancel to the pnimit, because the Eruv is there. So what's the issue? Hi bar pnimit lemani batel. Again, who's he going to cancel to? Libnei pnimit. So he could do to the bnei pnimit, but ikachitzonad asra alayu. But the outer people have an entrance to them and they can get through. And therefore, that's a problem. Libata libnei chitzona. If he relinquishes his rights to the outer, we already know. Ein bitur reshut mechatzer lechatzer. So again, if it's in the outer courtyard and the pnimit forgets, it's a problem. But what's the case? What if shachach echad, and that's, again, the Eruv is in the inner courtyard now in this case, and we wanted to see, could the inner courtyard people can't relinquish their rights? No, it won't work because they can't relinquish their rights to the outer courtyard, so it's still a problem. But shachach, and here we're going to finish, even though it's the next daf, I want to finish this idea. Shachach echad min hachitzona v'lo irev. What if the Eruv is in the inner courtyard? But who forgot that house C that we talked about, the left-hand house in outside courtyard? Obviously, it doesn't matter which house. I'm just giving you a visual. Vadai pnimi muteret. The pnimi is going to be allowed. Why? Well, they have an Eruv in the inner courtyard, and everyone in the inner courtyard joined the Eruv. So they're good. What's the issue? And this is what Shoshana brought up in her question before. They can close the gate. They can close this entrance and say, listen, you guys can't come into my space. Okay, you follow? There's an opening between the inner and the outer. We saw this in a previous case when we talked about the inner and the outer. The outer can't close their rights to the inner, although we did say that maybe they could in theory. But even if they do, it doesn't help the outer courtyard. They say, b'chitzona asura. The chitzona is for sure forbidden. Why? They can't carry within their courtyard because they can't, remember, where's the Eruv? It's in the inner courtyard. So they're in a different reshut, so they can't cancel. And they have a problem because one of their people didn't join the Eruv. However, the inner courtyard can basically close the door and say, listen, you guys in the outer courtyard can't come into my space. Now, why is that okay? Because the outer people don't need that space. Until now, they've been forbidding them because they could theoretically go into that space. But if they shut the gate and they say, listen, don't come into our space, and maybe, we'll use it for going out, but you can't come into our space, they basically can close off that space and say, we have our own space without you. And therefore, we can carry in our space. Okay, so that's the case where he says, Pa'amim, you can be bitul would work. Okay, so he basically says, if, in other words, right, so there's something, just 1 minute, Rashi says, Bahamo de Shmuel de mevat lebnei chitzona lebnei pnimit, o torishut shabalahen letochan al yedei hargil Eruvin, right, he says, basically, right, they can relinquish their rights to allow the inner courtyard to basically be able to carry. So they can't really be, in this case, we're going to basically say there is a situation where the inner courtyard isn't forbidden. Okay, that's the chidush of Rava. So whereas Abaye said, remember, Abaye said in this case, since they forbid, again, this is all explaining Shmuel. Shmuel said, so Abaye said in this case, there is bitul reshut. One can relinquish rights, no problem, because they all forbid each other. Came Rava and he said, no. In most of these cases, there's no relinquishing of rights. He kind of looked at it with a very close eye and said, who's relinquishing rights to who and how could this possibly work? And he understands literally, right? One can't relinquish rights to someone who's living in a different courtyard. And that's why this doesn't work in many of the scenarios, and only that one scenario, which is the issue that Shoshana brought up before, which is theoretically the inner courtyard is separate. And because they're separate and could separate themselves and could claim, don't walk in our space, because really only they have walking rights in the other space, they could close off, and therefore they can be okay to basically have their own Eruv. Okay, that's it for today, and we'll pick up tomorrow. Have a great day, everybody.